I am sure you will all agree with me on the fact that this summit's success is not only measured by the great discussions held therein, but also by the extent to which this successful summit becomes a new milestone for the deepening of the historical relations between the European and Arab regions.
Leaders from the European Union and Arab League met in Egypt for their first ever joint summit. At the top of the agenda was migration, security, trade and investment. The EU wants closer ties with the Arab world, and Egypt needs money. The summit was held within a week of Egypt executing 9 suspected members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were found guilty of assassinating prosecutor Hisham Barakat in 2015, but human rights groups say the men were convicted after being tortured into confessing. So, has the EU turned a blind eye to human rights abuses for the sake of financial gain? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Doha by Marwan Kabalan. He's the director of the policy analysis at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. In Washington, D.C., we have Emily Hawthorne, who's the Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor. And in Cairo, we have Mostafa Ragab. He's the director and founder of Egyptian Affairs UK. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Marwan, let me begin with you. We have the summit in Egypt. The questions are whether President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has earned the right to be the statesman to host this type of summit with the EU.
Well, I think the summit has given Abdel Fattah al-Sisi what he actually was seeking from having it in Sharm el-Sheikh. That is the sort of legitimacy and the sort of recognition by the European countries that he is the legitimate leader of Egypt on the one hand, and he's the strong man that they can rely on in order to deal with the 2 key issues the Europeans are mainly concerned about. That is security, i.e. terrorism on one hand, and the prevention of the refugees from coming to Europe, because Europe actually is looking at the Middle East as a source of these 2 elements. On one hand, refugees, on the other hand, terrorism. So I think they are now investing actually in what they call strong leaders, strong leadership, which is for many people here in this region means tyranny and dictatorship, in order to prevent the influx of refugees into Europe on one hand, and also to try and prevent terrorism. But in my opinion, the Europeans who have been actually pursuing this policy for a long time, they are actually shooting themselves in the foot. Why? Because when you have tyranny, when you have dictatorship in the Middle East, and they should by now know that, you produce actually, or you actually have the sort of fertile ground in order to breed terrorism on one hand and export refugees to Europe. Understood. On the one hand. Okay. On the other hand, okay. And the Syrian crisis actually was a very important demonstration of that. Okay,
Mostafa Ragab, we saw the tagline and the theme of the summit, investing in stability. Is that investing in stability at the expense of human rights, at the expense of democracy, at the expense of the rights of the people in support of authoritarianism?
Of course not. I mean, this is just a personal attack on the president. This is always happening. I mean, we're using the cards of human rights and all these cards that he's using to just attack the progress that Egypt is doing at the moment. Egypt is going in the right way. There is criminals. There is a justice system that people go through the justice system. Ended up with the Grand Imam to approve the justice system. So it's a long procedure before those criminals get prosecuted. We're not going to spend a fortune on them in prison to keep them in prison. If they are killers, they're going to be executed. As simple as that. And if people just say they not, and they've been forced to say what they said, no, they have not been forced. There is a system that they go through to prove that they're guilty.
Okay, you're absolutely certain that they weren't tortured?
Have the Attorney General in Egypt been killed or not? He's been killed. Who killed him? Who planted all these bombs in the streets of Egypt? It is those criminals who got to be charged, who got to pay for what they done.
Okay, that's not answering my question, because it could still have been somebody else. and the wrong people had confessed through torture and were executed. But let me move on here. Let me bring in Emily Hawthorne. Emily Hawthorne, from the European perspective, do they think along the lines of Mostafa Ragab that there's not too much bad going on within Egypt? Or are they looking at it geopolitically and thinking there's authoritarianism, but we need to strike a deal with Sisi because he's better than the rest of a very bad bunch out there?
I think it's really important to look at the context of what happened over the last 2 days in Sharm el-Sheikh. This was not just a meeting between EU leaders and Egypt. Yes, it was hosted in Egypt, but it was a meeting between Arab League members hosted by Egypt and a whole array of European leaders. There were 50 countries there altogether, and there were a lot of heads of state there, especially from the European side. The European side, as well as the Arab world, they both have economic interests, they both have security interests, and they both have strategic interests that they need the other side to cooperate on in order to be able to progress those interests. So the Europeans know that if they want to make progress on counter-terror initiatives in the region, if they want to try and work towards strategic interests like trying to counter growing Chinese influence in the region or growing Russian influence in the Middle East region, they need to be present. They need to be working with these governments. And I don't think it's that there is not a concern about human rights abuses in Egypt or in any other Arab country. But pragmatically and practically, you need to work with Sisi if you want to get anything done in the broader Mediterranean region. And I think that that's the sort of practical angle that you're seeing a lot of these European countries coming from, even though they are concerned about human rights abuses.
Okay, so Marwan, it's about something that's far bigger than Sisi and Egypt, the host. It's about being pragmatic and practical, and they both need each other. Do you accept that?
Chinese and Russian influence and pragmatism shouldn't be used as an excuse in order to condone authoritarianism in the Middle East. Most of the regimes right now in the Middle East are mainly tyrants, including of course President Sisi. There was no transparency about the execution of the 9 young men actually who were accused of killing the Attorney General in Egypt. We all know also that the judicial system in Egypt is not independent, so there is a big question mark about this. But I don't think the Europeans, they are not making themselves good actually by trading what they think security and the prevention of the influx of refugees from the south actually by giving this sort of recognition and legitimacy to the regimes in the south. I think the Europeans are making a big mistake because, as I said earlier, they are just postponing the big explosion in the region. We have seen that in 2011, and probably we are going to see it again, and Europe will be flooded with refugees if the big explosion is going to take place, and they are going to also suffer from terrorism because tyranny, the lack of democracy, is the breeding ground for terrorism and actually is the main source of refugees. So I think the Europeans, they must actually be wise. They must have, they must think for the future rather than having this very short-sighted strategy by thinking that by condoning these tyrants, actually they are protecting themselves from refugees and from terrorism. They must, in my opinion, promote democracy the way they did in Eastern Europe rather than promote and support tyranny in the Middle East.
Mostafa Ragab.
I think the Europeans have been very, very wise with this move. I mean, he's saying they should be wise. They are very wise by making this move because they need to work together now. The European need the Middle East, and the Middle East is led by Egypt. And Egypt is doing a lot of progress, and there is a recognition for the work that has been done in Egypt to have this conference there. This summit proves that Egypt is going in the right direction. If we're going to sing that song forever about human rights and democracy, forget about it. We need to build Egypt. We're not going to listen to those people
but do you accept
talking
that?
about
are you
admitting
Mustafa?
Human rights is an issue.
Okay,
human
Mustafa,
rights is an issue all over the world. Don't talk about Egypt.
Are you admitting that you don't need to respect human rights and you don't need democracy to build Egypt?
No. Don't put words in my mouth.
I'm
human
asking
rights
you.
are respected, but it's a card that you play with all the time against Egypt. Human rights issue is all over the world. We respect that. But why Egypt? Why are you raising that card always in the face of the politics in Egypt? It's something that exists all over the world. We respect human rights, of course, we recognize human rights, but don't raise that card all the time in the face of the progress that Egypt is doing. Look at the economy in Egypt.
You, Mr. Ragab.
Look at the tourism industry coming back in Egypt.
Mr.
Look at the terrorism.
I can assure you.
Look at the terrorism and the success.
We don't do a travel show. This is not a travel program.
We're achieving in Egypt in fighting terrorism.
Mr. Ragab, very clearly,
did not succeed
very
to come
clearly and
inside
unequivocally,
Egypt.
this is not a tourism or travel program, right? And I assure you,
it is not. It's economic.
If 9 people were not executed and human rights, listen. Hold on for a second. If 9 people were not executed,
they will be executed. They committed a crime.
If Human Rights Watch said nothing about it, Mr. Ragab, if Human Rights Watch said nothing about it, if Amnesty International said nothing about it, we wouldn't bring it up, right? So you're saying we're trying to bring up human rights. I'm saying this is what the human rights organizations are talking about.
Listen,
and it's naive to say it doesn't happen in a political context.
Those human rights organizations, who fund them? Where do they get the fund from? Do you want to tell me that those human rights organizations are free to work? They're not directed by the people who funded them?
Who do you think funds them?
And they raise that card whenever it's needed.
Who do you think funds them?
Where do they get the fund from?
Who do you think funds them? Why do you think there's a conspiracy against Egypt?
The people behind the work, of course there is. Okay. People wanted Egypt to be like Iraq and Syria and Libya. Okay. But the people in Egypt and the army in Egypt will no way allow this to happen. Egypt is a country that's going to stand and is going to progress and going to go back to be a great Egypt because the plots and everything that been planned did not succeed.
Okay, it's very helpful.
China is not going to be the Islamic country, I'll tell you that.
So, let me bring in Marwan here. And I'll ask him the same question. They're meeting, they're talking.
Marwan just hates Egypt. Marwan just hates everything in Egypt.
How do you know that?
He doesn't approve of anything. From his talk. All he's talking is about the terrorists, the killers.
Hate Egypt. I love Egypt. I wish
no, you don't love Egypt. You love Egypt. You will never talk that bad about Egypt.
The way that is Egypt. No.
Where do you live, Mr. Marwan?
Where do you live? Against in Egypt is the way actually. Regardless where I live, Mr. Najib, Egypt is like my country. I am an Arab. I love Egypt. I want Egypt to be a very strong and prosperous country. I want Egypt also to be a democratic country. I don't want Egypt to be ruled by this way. I don't wish Egypt any ill. I know Egypt is the leader of the Arab world.
If that is true, then you will not attack. If that is true, you will not attack Egypt in that way. If that is true, then you will help Egypt to progress.
No, I'm not attacking Egypt.
Something good to say about Egypt.
I'm not attacking
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
I'm not attacking Egypt.
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
I'm not attacking Egypt.
When was the last time you've been
in Egypt? Give him a chance.
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
Go ahead, Marwan.
Just a few years ago. Just a few years ago.
When was the last time you've been in Egypt?
He's answering you now. Let him finish.
I was in 2013.
In Egypt?
In 2013.
My goodness gracious. I'm talking to you from Egypt
now.
I'm
telling you, I was in Egypt 2013.
And I can see the progress. And I can see how Egypt is a safe country.
I understand, but you are saying that I hate Egypt. I do not hate.
Okay, listen, gentlemen. Marwan, I'm going to give you 20 seconds to wrap us up because we're out of time. So please, Mr. Ragab, if you don't interrupt, I'd appreciate it. Marwan, finish up for us. 20 seconds, please, sir.
Well, actually, Egypt is, as I said before, Egypt is a very important country. We would like actually this summit to have a place, to take place in Egypt. But what we are actually concerned about Egypt is this violation of human rights, the lack of transparency, the lack of independent judiciary in Egypt. We want Egypt to be the leader of the Arab world. Egypt cannot be the leader of the Arab world when it's ruled by this sort of leadership.
Okay. Mostafa Ragab, Marwan Kabalan, and earlier Emily Hawthorne, I thank you all for joining us.
We've had the best leadership so far, and we're going to progress despite whatever anybody says.
Okay, well, we hope so. We hope so. Mr. Ragab, Mr. Kabalan, and Ms. Hawthorne, thanks so much.